Sarah Pierce-Taylor, and I'm an assistant professor of religion, literature, and visual culture at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And I do research and teach on religion in South Asia and a wide range of traditions: Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Jainism. But my research is primarily focused on Jainism from about the 9th to 12th centuries, mostly in South India. And today I'm going to be talking about the genre of a text called the Ādipurāṇa, which means, I like to translate it at least, as history from the beginning, but perhaps more literally it means something like the epic of Adinatha, the first Tirthankara of the Jain tradition. And this text, this genre, is the first chapter in a larger genre that part of the tradition calls a Mahapurana, and another part of the tradition calls a Trishasti Shalaka Purusha Charita. So I'm going to be talking about, on the one hand, Jinasena's Ādipurāṇa and his larger project of the Mahapurana that he jointly composed with his student Gunabhadra. And I'm also going to be talking about a Kannada, an old Kannada version of this same story of Adinatha, written by the Adikavi, the first poet of the Kannada language, Pampa. I'm also going to make reference to a few other related Jain texts, including Hemachandra's Trishasti Shakala Purusha Charita, as well as maybe occasionally a few other texts written in Kannada as well. I'm going to be talking about how this body of text has been received in scholarship and how we might think about these differently or through a different lens. More specifically, I'm going to be contrasting the idea of these texts as part of a Jain universal history, or these texts as part of a kind of karmic network of souls, what I call a karmic family. So before I get too far into the details of these texts, I want to give a little bit of background, which is when the Marty Center approached me to talk about a foundational text in Jainism, I had a really hard time picking a text. And there's a couple of reasons for why that is. On the one hand, not a lot of people know about Jainism, so any kind of discussion about Jainism is going to require some background, which I'm going to do today. And mostly when people think about Jainism, they think of a tradition that's almost synonymous with nonviolence, which is definitely true to some degree. The value of nonviolence, or ahimsa, is very important and central to the Jain tradition. People might also know a little bit more of the history, which is that Jainism broke off from what we might call Vedic Hinduism between around 900 and 600 BC, alongside Buddhism in a period that I like to compare to like Berkeley in the 1960s. It's a period of kind of like radical overturn of authority, a period that is actually called the Shramana period, or the period of the strivers. So another thing that people might know about this tradition is that it is focused on the worship and emulation of 24 perfected beings called Tirthankaras, forward makers, or Jinas, victors. But unlike other traditions, for various reasons, Jainism does not have a universally agreed upon set of texts, be that scriptural, literary, philosophical, doctrinal. Jainism has a kind of complicated textual history. There are a couple reasons for this. One of these is sectarian. So there are two main sects within Jainism. So there is a tradition called the Digambaras and the Shwetambaras, and they disagree on a number of really important issues. A major one is the spiritual liberation, or the possibility of spiritual liberation of women, the proper conduct and dress of monks, and this is actually a kind of fundamental issue. So the tradition's two sectarian names are actually translate to the descriptions of what the monks are supposed to wear. So for example, the Shwetambara tradition literally means white clad, and Digambara means sky clad. So the monks in the Shwetambara tradition wear white robes, and the monks in the Digambara tradition are nude. But perhaps the most pressing difference between these two sects is actually around their scriptural corpus. So at a certain point, the Digambara tradition looked at the remaining scriptural canon of the sort of teachings and life of the Tirthankaras, and they decided and sort of identified that the traditional corpus was corrupted beyond measure. And so I think this might be one of the only historical examples of a religious tradition completely letting go of its primary scriptural canon, whereas the Shwetambar community held on to those texts. So the Digambara community and the Shwetambar community have very different textual or scriptural corpuses. And one of the things that the Digambaras proceeded to do is to produce a secondary canon. So they started to write a wide range of texts that sort of filled in this gap of what had been the originary canon. And one of the things that they wrote that became part of the secondary canon were pieces of literature, like the Ādipurāṇa, the Mahapurāṇa, particularly in Sanskrit. So part of the secondary canon is Jinasena's Ādipurāṇa and jointly composed Mahapurāṇa. So another reason why talking about Jain texts and identifying a primary text is so difficult is also about regional differentiation. So Jainism took root in various places in South Asia and in modern day India at various times and places. And so the Shwetambar and Digambara traditions became established in northwest India, particularly in the modern day states of Gujarat and Rajasthan, as well as in South India in the modern state of Tamil Nadu, and in the area that I work on, which is an area called the Deccan, that sort of spans a bridge between this northwest Indian region and the south. And this area is comprised primarily of the modern day states of Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and parts of southern Maharashtra. So we have sectarianism. On the one hand, we have these two different understandings of what Jainism is, and then layered on top of that is this kind of geographical regional differentiation. And why region matters so much in the subcontinent is because the plurality of languages. This means that Jains were writing their pieces of literature, their kind of guides to lay conduct, various kinds of texts, in a vast number of languages, including Sanskrit and Prakrit as kind of sacerdotal languages, but also in what we call vernacular languages or regional languages like Gujarati, Hindi, Tamil, Kannada. And so we have a range of texts that belong to different communities in different times and places. So Jinasena, who wrote a Sanskrit Ādipurāṇa and was embarking on the broader project of writing a Mahapurāṇa, was writing in the modern day state of Karnataka under the patronage of the Rashtrakuta kings, whose capital was in Malkhet or Manyaketa in the 9th century. And Pampa was writing basically a century later in the 10th century in Old Kannada under the patronage of the Eastern Chalukyas. Jinasena intended to write this voluminous and epic text that spanned all of Jain universal history. He died in the process, and his student Gunabhadra finished the whole universal history. Pampa set out to write just one chapter of the universal history, the first chapter of the life of Adinatha. And that's quite common for Jain authors. To write a Mahapurāṇa or a Trishasti text was a lifelong endeavor that not many people attempted to do. And more commonly, people would write either Puranas or Charitas about one Tirthankara. So Neminatha, Parshvanatha, Adinatha, various stories of the lives of the 24 Tirthankaras. But together, all of the lives of these figures go into something or combine together into something that we call a universal history. So what is a Jain universal history? Well, the tradition is pretty clear. This is the story of the 63 great men. And I'm using the word men here pretty intentionally because for the Digumbara tradition, there were no women included in this system. For the Shwetambars, there is one Tirthankara Malinath who is considered to have been born a woman. But I think that particularly within the Digumbara perspective, this is a largely male-dominated structure of universal history. So this Jain universal history takes place within a Jain understanding of time, a Jain cosmology. And Jain cosmology is structured around descending and ascending periods or eras of human sadness and flourishing. So the descending cycle of Avasarpini is when the world becomes overtaken slowly by sadness. And the ascending cycle of Utsarpini is when the world is animated by prosperity and flourishing. For our purposes, the important era that we want to look at is this fourth part of the cycle. It occurs on both the descending and ascending sides, which is called Dushama and Sushama. And we might translate this as happiness with a little bit of sorrow. And so the entirety of this cycle of 63 great men or 63 great beings, it happens in this little slice of this larger cosmology. One of the other things to say about Jain universal histories is that they're entirely structured by a Jain understanding of time, space, matter. So this is a world that is enacting the world of Jainism. So both Shwetambars and Digambaras write in the genre of universal history. Digambaras call these Mahapuranas, or great epics, and Shwetambaras call these Trishasti Shakala Purusha Charitas, or the story of the 63 great men of the tradition. And the contents of these texts, even though they have different names or different titles, are largely the same. So you have 24 Tirthankaras. So these are the 24 perfected beings of the tradition that center the tradition. Then we have 12 Chakravartins, or universal emperors, who achieve liberation as siddhas, or perfected souls. And then we have 9 Vasudevas. These are half Chakravartin heroes who are reborn in hell, very good for literature, for killing their enemies, but are liberated in their future lives. And then there are 9 Baladevas. These are the brothers of the Vasudevas and virtuous kings who rule the world. And then finally, every story needs an anti-hero. We have the 9 Prativasudevas. These are evil kings who are reborn in hell and are the enemies of the Vasudevas. This is a very unchanging, unrelenting structure. And the relationships between the 63 great beings are defined by a dynamic of a struggle over good and evil. So they're really exciting stories. They're stories that you read them and you think, oh, it makes sense that someone will want to write this again and again and again in different languages. Now I want to zero in on one particular chapter of this Mahapurana structure, and that is the first life of the Tirthankara Ādinatha. And the reason why I want to just take a moment to think about the life of Ādinatha is because his life is the first life in the structure of 63 beings, and his life becomes the sort of paradigmatic model for all subsequent lives of the Tirthankaras. Lori, 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 lori. So the life of Ādinatha is particularly important because he becomes a model for all subsequent Tirthankaras. And the scholar Klaus Brun has shown us that Jains were actually pretty aware of the repetition within their own narrative tradition. And he explores a text that theorizes a kind of slot system, what's called in Sanskrit sthanas. And the idea is that based on the life of the first Tirthankara, we see the development of these slots or these categories that have to be filled. So the category is stable across all 24 Tirthankaras, but the contents of the category of the slot changes based on each of the 24 Tirthankaras. So while the sort of individual nuances of the story change, the broader structure is the same. So for example, every Tirthankara has a father. The name of the father changes from Tirthankara to Tirthankara. And each Tirthankara exists in this kind of cosmological battle of the 63 great beings and this dynamic of good and evil. And what that means is that the story of Adinatha is the most fully developed and elaborate of all of the 24 Tirthankaras. So what I've just described here of this kind of repetitious, patterned life of the Tirthankara set within the Jain universal history is largely how Jain scholars have understood the genre of the Mahapurana and the Trishasti and the role of the Ādipurāṇa within that structure. While the system of the 63 great men is undeniable as a foundational structure for Jain literature, I would argue that it actually has very little narratological interest for Jain authors writing in Sanskrit and Kannada. And the reason I say this is because Jain authors like Jinasena and Pampa only glancingly engage with the structure of the 63 great men. So for example, we find King Bharata, who's the son of the first Tirthankara, Adinatha, asking the question, so in the declining age of a Sarpini, there are how many Jinas and how many Chakravartins, how many Baladevas? He asked Rishabha to further explain how many Prativasudevas. And Adinatha's answer is best. Like you might think, oh, this is like an opportunity for Adinatha to explain the whole system of 63 great men. He doesn't. He just kind of gives this vague answer at best. And in the frame story of the Mahapurana, we have a definition of the Mahapurana as a collection of stories that have 63 characteristics or qualities, lakshanas, that describe the figures in the tradition who have totalizing knowledge of the scriptures, of good dharma, and who have taken birth in Jambudvipa, so that's the land of the subcontinent. But again, we don't get anything more than these kind of vague answers, right? These kind of general descriptions of like, oh, there's 63, the number 63 is important. So this begs a set of questions. Are the Jain Puranas really about the 63 great men? And if they're not, what are they actually about? And so I want to try and answer that for us today. And I want to bring us to a concept called the Bavali. And Bavali is a term made up of Bava, which means birth, and Avali, which means a sort of sequence or chain. So we might translate this to something like a chain of births or a continuous series of births. And it's interesting because scholars in India, in writing in English, and especially those writing in Kannada, have already been thinking through this narrative phenomena through the terms that medieval Jain authors use themselves, right? So when we are looking at these texts, we do see this kind of Trishasti system, the universal system in place, but we also see this kind of counter structure of the continuous sequence of birth, the Bavali. And that seems to be the place where there's actually a lot more narrative interest and excitement. The Shastriya Kannada website, which is this website for classical Kannada, has this really great entry on Bavali that really points out that this concept of Bavali is a Jain innovation that actually then penetrates into other religious communities writing in Kannada, including the Virashaivas. So this website has a really great entry. I'm just going to read the first two sentences. Bavali is an important concept in Jaina theology, and it is used as a creative device to achieve various goals in Kannada literary works composed by Jaina poets. The description of the previous births of Tirthankaras in achronological order is called Bavali. So we see in India scholars recognizing this as a really important aspect of Jain literature, but scholars in America and Europe who are working on Jain literature have largely ignored this as a kind of structuring phenomena. And Bavali's, as this entry sort of alludes to, can concern a single soul moving through transmigration or samsara, but most commonly it concerns a cluster of souls connected together who transmigrate over time through a succession of multiple rebirths. And I like to call this a karmic family. And I'll talk about why I call it karma in a second. And the famed Kannada scholar R.S. Mugli calls this a Bavali tangle, which I think is just such an amazing phrase, because it really captures what is at the essence of this literary phenomena, which is the messiness, the difficulty, the confusion of moving through transmigration. But really importantly, and this is something that I think has not been emphasized enough in Jain studies and the study of Jain literature, is that we have this idea that transmigration is a process of the single soul, of the Atma, moving through a series of rebirths alone. That this is a solitary endeavor, that samsara is lonely. One of the things that Jain literature shows us is that transmigration is a surprisingly collective experience. So these networks of souls transmigrating together can produce extremely complicated narrative structures. And in fact, when I started working on these texts, I would have these kind of hilarious notebooks full of charts trying to keep track of who was what when and who knew what, who knew whom at what point. And I still find this to be actually one of the best ways to unpack this literature. So I wanted to just zero in on a set of souls to illustrate how this structure works. So in the third incarnation of the Tirthankara Adinath, when he was born as Lalitanga, he had 4 ministers who all held various different beliefs. And these beliefs within a Jain perspective are false belief, including one of the ministers who is a Buddhist. And so I've marked these souls on the slide in red. So these souls, these 4 souls are reborn as animals in their next birth, right? So in the 4th birth of Adinatha, when he's born as Vajrajanga. And now I've marked their rebirths in yellow. So they're reborn as animals. And when Vajrajanga, again, the 4th incarnation of Adinatha, encounters a Jain monk and listens to his teaching, the 4 former ministers who are now incarnated as a lion, boar, monkey, and goose emerge from the forest, and they're drawn to him. They're drawn to their former king, who they served as a minister. But they're also drawn to the monk who is teaching Jainism. And they all sit together and listen to the monk preach and receive the teachings of Jainism. And the monk looks at this group of beings and says, let me tell you why you know each other. Let me tell you your Bavali, right? And so they listen to their Bavali, and that recognition of the path of their souls enables them to go on to then achieve a better birth. And collectively, they move together to better and better births. And one of the things that's so distinctive about this is these souls are moving together, constellating around the spiritually advanced soul of the Tirthankara. And they are reborn as his servants, his friends, his companions, and eventually in their final births as his relatives. And their attachment and affection for Adinatha takes many forms. And one of the things that's so interesting is this affection persists across bodies, including animal bodies. Even in their animal incarnations, they still have this attachment, affection, intimacy for the Tirthankara. So other examples of Jain literature are less involved. Again, the story of Adinatha's rebirths, which happens over 11 rebirths, is particularly complicated. But the basic structural logic persists of clusters of souls transmigrating across time together. And one of the things that I think is so striking is the ability of emotion to be stable across transmigrating bodies and across a spectrum of the soul's possibility. from animals and hell beings to gods to humans, we see that there is a kind of consistency to affection, to attachment, right? So the incarnation may change, but the underlying feeling doesn't. It stays the same. And like the story of Ādinatha, the narrative of the 23rd Tirthankara, Parshvanatha, and another really famous narrative within Jain literature called the Yashodhara Charita, or the story of King Yashodhara, illustrates that animals, just like humans, participate in this emotional ontology, this emotional materiality, in which feelings adhere to souls rather than to bodies, and even as that feeling produces particular kinds of embodiments. So from a Jain soteriological perspective, that is to say from the perspective of how one achieves liberation, it seems that one's karma, one's consequences of previous action, be it good or bad, is not the sole factor in determining one's birth, right? And so one of the things that defines these Shramana religions, these striving religions like Jainism and Buddhism, is this concept of karma, right? The idea that something that you do in a past life, maybe many lives ago, bears fruit in the future, in your future lives, in the present. That is well true, and these traditions are karmic traditions. But I think that what this literature shows us is that emotional ties do play a kind of under-theorized role in the shape of transmigration. And the Jain scholar Padmanabh Jaini puts this so beautifully, that there wouldn't be karmic accumulation, right? The soul could not accumulate karma within Jainism without emotion wedding the soul, making it so that karma can stick. And so within Jainism, emotion plays a really central role to karmic accumulation. It is the glue. It is the stickiness that allows karma to stick to the soul. And in Jain literature, this understanding of karma as wedded by emotion or facilitated by emotion really comes to the fore in very, I think, powerful ways. So I want to just also give us an example that we can actually get a sense of what this material emotion looks like within the corpus. And I want to pull an example from Ādinatha's 7th incarnation when he's born as King Suvidi, and he has this relationship, this intense, very loving relationship with his son Keshava or Keshavanka. One of the sort of structuring features of royal life within the Jain Mahapurana tradition is that kings, particularly on the Digambara side of things, is that kings renounce their kingdoms. And so King Suvidi feels a sort of impulse to renounce, but something's holding him back. He can't quite bring himself to do it. And it's his love for his son. And so this is a quote from Pampa's Ādipurāṇa. And he says, Suvidi became entangled in the expansive love from his previous life towards his son. He discarded that white umbrella, the symbol of his power, and became an excellent householder. There is always love at the lotus-like feet of the Lord Jina. And so here we see a kind of alternative vision of royal renunciation, which is he becomes, instead of becoming a monk and renouncing his kingdom, he becomes a kind of paradigmatic Jain householder. And the next verse, I just want to excerpt a little bit, says, the tight bonds of karma loosen very slowly from the gross body. So the text is actually giving us an explanation for why he can't let go of his son, because he has some sort of karmic attachment, some sort of emotionally charged karmic attachment to Keshavanka. And when we look at the Bavali, when we look at that Bavali tangle, that messiness of souls connected to each other, we know why. And that is because Suvidi and Keshavanka were previously born in Ādinatha's 3rd incarnation as Lalitanga and his lover Swayamprabha, and then in the 4th incarnation as Vajrajanga and Srimati, and then as Arya Vajrajanga and Arya Srimati, and then as Sridhara and Swayamprabha. And this Swayamprabha and Swayamprabha are signaling actually a gender change. In the sixth incarnation, the soul of Srimati is transformed into a man. And so after that, she takes male birth. And part of this is her proximity to the kind of powerful potency, spiritual potency of the Tirthankara. So in her earlier births, she's his lover. And then in her subsequent births, she's born as his servant, friend, and so on and so forth, until eventually she is born in her final birth as Shreyamsa. And so in this final birth, Adinatha is born as Rishabha, and this is when he achieves liberation as the Tirthankara. And Shreyamsa is really important in the last life of Adinatha because she is born as Shreyamsa, and he is the Dana Tirthakara, or the person who breaks the Tirthankara's fast. And it's actually fascinating because, again, Bharata, Adinatha's son, is like, hey, how did you know to do that? How did you know to give him sugarcane juice and to break his fast? And then Shreyamsa narrates his own Bavali and says, well, in Adinatha's first birth, this is how I knew him. This is how I loved him. In his second birth, this is who I was. And actually, you know, one of the interesting things in the kind of pronoun usage of this section of the text is Shreyamsa says, she was me. I am her, right? And so there's this kind of accumulation of knowledge and insight that Shreyamsa has over time, over transmigration, that allows him to have this special insight, special intimacy to the Tirthankara. One of the things that we see with the example of Shreyamsa is how Jain texts like the Ādipurāṇa handle love, right? That the text starts out with a series of rebirths that are bound around erotic love and sex and intimacy, and that winnows away into things like friendship and servitude, parental relationships like Suvidhi and Keshava, and then ultimately into a relationship defined by devotion, bhakti. So that Shreyamsa actually becomes this paradigmatic figure of how lay people are supposed to have a relationship of devotion to the Tirthankara. So these complicated networks of souls are a really different way of understanding an equally complicated system of the 63 great men of the Jain tradition. And both are operative, both have a role in structuring Jain literature. But I hope what we've kind of seen today and what you can take away from the readings that I've given of this text is that rather than being interested in the sort of universal structure, Jain authors like Jinasena and Pampa were really interested in the ways in which the genre of the Mahapurana and the genre of the Ādipurāṇa offered up certain kinds of emotional affordances to explore what it means to be a human being or an animal in a body, and in relation to other people and to other souls, and how one should navigate those relationships and manage those emotions. Jainism is a really understudied tradition, and so I hope watching this video has perhaps piqued a little bit of your interest to read Jain literature more widely, what's available, but to also consider studying Jainism. Within the field of religious studies, Jain studies is on the up and up, and the Jain community has been amazingly dynamic in providing donations for postdocs, endowed chairs, lecturers all over the United States and Europe. And so this is a real area of growth. And, you know, as a scholar of Jain literature, I can say that this corpus of texts, you know, these are just a few examples of a much wider and richer tradition, much of which has been untouched. So if you're ever looking for something to study, to read, that is waiting for a reader, Jain literature is definitely the place I would suggest looking.